Okay, so welcome to How Do Austen's Heroes Change? And anybody want to kind of get the ball rolling on who you feel like changes the most?
I think Emma has to. I think Emma does.
Yeah. How about in terms of the heroes?
Oh, you want the men?
Yeah.
Okay, not hero wins. Okay, well, I'll have to think about that one more.
I have to go with Darcy.
Besides Darcy, yeah, I was trying to think of another one besides Darcy.
Wentworth.
He definitely understands his foibles, perhaps, or he understands why that he really did come off as being pompous.
This is Mary. I think Edmund Bertram probably changes the most in that he was, of course, in love with Mary Crawford, and then he realizes how misguided he was, and then he falls in love with Fanny rather than just being a brother to her. So I think he has to be near the top of the list too.
Yes, you're right.
Michelle's question about Henry Tilney, I'm not sure that Henry Tilney changes at all. He has a reason to stand up to his father, but I believe that previously, had there been a reason to stand up to his father, he would have. But it's just his father's treatment of Catherine makes him actually do it. But I think that he would have previously, had there been a good enough reason to. Anyway, what do other people think?
As a super Tilney basher, I'll give him credit for maybe in the future, we don't see it in the book, but in the future, reining in his wit and using it a little less loosely, i.e. telling Catherine stories of the haunted abbey, and his not telling the truth about his brother when Catherine specifically asks. I think next time that comes up, maybe he'll be a little less guarded. Yep, my brother's a jackass. Oh, I'm sorry. Shouldn't have used that word. But my brother is horrible.
I think that might have been because they didn't have the kind of relationship where they could talk about that, though, because they weren't together. And potentially once they are together, he can be more honest about his brother. But I do agree with you about the making jokes and telling stories, because Catherine kind of believed him, and that's kind of a little bit maybe his fault that she thought his father was a murderer. Maybe.
So some of the criticism like that you read about Henry Tilney, like the feminists think he's kind of as misogynistic as his father or his brother. And so it's kind of interesting to read like the last Persuasions volume that was dedicated to Northanger Abbey. There were a couple of articles in there where they were basically saying like, yeah, he's kind of a jerk, and he's, not, he, looks down on women. And I think, I think there's a real question with critics of, yeah, is he actually a good match for Catherine?
But he does understand muslins. And he even shops for his sister. I think his relationship with his sister is very sound.
Yeah, and she says, oh, you're going to think that he really hates women, but he doesn't, right? He's just joking, so I think she would know if he was really looking down on women.
Yeah,
and I think that's the thing that they miss, that he's poking fun. He's not actually believing the thing that he says. Like the talking about Northanger Abbey being haunted, when he's saying derisive things about women. See, I did not swear. He's actually joking, because it's very hard to get Henry Tilney to be serious.
Yeah, I feel like there's this sense of like if he hadn't met Catherine, like he could have become similar to like sort of the Mr. Bennet kind of level of sarcasm and like never really connecting with people.
Yes, 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 yes.
Marla, did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to change to a different hero, if that's okay. I wanted to say that I think Mr. Knightley changes in certain ways. I think he becomes more open-minded. He sort of, at the very beginning, he dismisses Emma's relationship with Harriet Smith as, you know, being negative for Emma. But I think over time he comes to see some of Harriet's, you know, positive traits, which I think is, you know, shows something about him. And also at the dance, I think when they talk about Mr. Knightley, he's older, and we know that he's an older hero, but I think over the course of the book he actually sort of becomes a little bit more youthful. I mean, dancing at one of the dances rather than standing against the wall with the older men, which bothers Emma. So I think Mr. Knightley changes in a positive way.
I think Mr. Knightley also changes from being more of a teacher, instructor, kind of overseeing Emma, to being more of the man who's going to fall in love with her. But at first he kind of thinks he has to control her behavior and be like a parent to.
Yeah, because he's so much older than she and had known her since she was a child. So he would have that more parental kind of attitude toward her.
They do say, Jane does write at the end that they become more like partners, more, they're more on an equal basis.
Yeah.
Well, so that definitely, that I think captures that sentiment very nicely.
It seems to me that their relationship changes to more from an adult-child relationship to an adult relationship. You know, he finally realizes she's grown up, and yes, she has assimilated a lot of the advice that he's given her, and suddenly he's looking at her, as kind of an equal, but just another adult.
I think he also realizes that he tried to teach her in the wrong way. I think Jane Austen is pretty clear that like lecturing someone isn't how they learn how to be a better person. And, you know, he admits that he lectured her, and, you know, that wasn't the best way to do it.
Yeah, he really apologizes to her for that, doesn't he? So I think he has changed.
Plus, nothing like discovering that you're jealous of Frank Churchill.
Yeah.
to bring reality up front.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times in Jane Austen, people are recognizing their flaws, and that's how they change. So yeah, that makes sense that would be true for Knightley as well.
Do you feel like when Knightley rebuked her at the Box Hill picnic that he shouldn't have?
She needed that.
No, he
He
was
needed that, and
correct in
that led to her changing. So yeah, he needed to do that. I don't know, do y'all think he did it in the best way? Could he have done it better? I don't know.
Oh, well, I think he could have been kinder about it, but he was so angry that, you know, that kind of got the better of him.
But I think that's what really brought her up to realize how bad she was, and that she really had to think. It got her attention.
Yeah,
If
I agree
he
with
had done
Nancy.
it in a very gentle way, it might not have gotten her attention as how important it was.
And we would have been robbed of a wonderful line. Badly done.
Yeah.
I think it's more than that he was angry, which I agree, he was angry, but I think he was hurt for Miss Bates. You know, I think
Yeah.
he was showing tremendous empathy for Miss Bates, and he couldn't
Yes.
contain it himself.
Yeah, that's more
Yeah.
accurate. You're right.
Mhm.
And she wasn't feeling that empathy, so that's why he needed to confront her.
Yes.
Mhm.
And it needed to be harsh so that when she thinks he could love Harriet, she can like only remember Box Hill as him, not him doing it from a sense of justice, not from a sense of like caring about her. And that there had to be that sense of, you know, him being mortified by what she did, but not like caring about her so that she could think, well, maybe he really does love Harriet and he doesn't love me. Because she really thinks about that when she's going over in her mind, you know, does he care for me or not? And that kind of leads to some of the confusion during the proposal scene.
I agree. But one question I've always had about the scene at Box Hill when he chastises Emma is he says to her, by way of explanation about Miss Bates, he says, she is poor and she will only get poorer. And that's why you shouldn't treat her that way, which I've always been a little confused by that, because to me it seems you don't treat anyone the way Emma treated Miss Bates. I'm not sure why he's like waving her poverty or her relative poverty around as if that's the explanation as to why Emma behaved so badly.
It's
I think
because
part of it,
and a hierarchical society very well. We don't have that much experience with it. That's
But what
my-
if she'd insulted the new Mrs. Elton?
I don't think he would have told her off as harshly if it was Mrs. Elton. Not only because Mrs. Elton is annoying,
But
but
she's more on a level with
she's
Emma.
more on a level. It's okay. You can't punch down. It's a thing with comedians, right? You're allowed to make fun of people on the same level you, people above you. You do not punch down. And that is what Emma is doing.
And another thing with that, and another reason not to punch down from my experience with just kind of reading about those times, is that people see you punching down. So that means if Emma behaves that way, other people will think, okay, this is all right. So Mr. Knightley in his role, I think what Frances says is a really important point. And I've had that, Marla, I've had those same thoughts in reading that passage. And it kind of seemed like Mr. Knightley in his role is kind of overall, you know, being responsible for that particular part of the country or part of, you know, that village. That sort of thing would be important to him, and it would be important for him to explain that to Emma.
So you're saying that she was setting a bad example by doing that, and I agree. But also, like, she was essentially beating up on someone who couldn't fight back, right? So, like, if she insulted Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she would be able to, you know, hold her own and punch back, right? And put Emma down. I know it's a different novel, but anyway. Yeah. But with Miss Bates, she couldn't respond in any way that would get Emma back or get herself back to her level. So I think that was the idea of the social levels, that you don't attack people who are below you because they have no recourse.
I think that had she said it not in front of Miss Bates, but still in front of that crowd, that he would have told her off, because it is teaching other people that it's okay to treat Miss Bates that way. If it had just been him and Mrs. Weston, he'd be like, really, Emma? But he wouldn't get so upset about it because that's more private and it's to do with her position in society and the way that people see her. But also in general, when you think about things like casual racism or casual misogyny, etc., if people don't get called out by those things, they think it's okay. And that's part of it. And hopefully, I don't know, Mrs. Elton could learn some things if Emma starts behaving better.
Also, doesn't he say something about I'm not going to have much more time to talk to you this way. Is that referring to her reaching an age of majority, or is that referring to him knowing that there's going to be a romantic crisis soon and he's going to show his colors? What do you think?
I think he thinks she's going with Frank Churchill. And I think that's why he says that,
Okay.
that she'll either marry Frank or, yeah.
But playing
This
devil's advocate here, isn't Knightley, doesn't he figure out that they're secretly engaged, Jane and Frank, before anybody else does?
He does. He
He's
does,
just-
but he might not be certain. I think he definitely figures something out. Something's going on, and he tries to warn Emma, but he might not know that it has proceeded to the extent, to such an advanced place where they're actually secretly engaged. He might think that there's still an opportunity there for Emma. He's just cautioning her that things aren't as they seem on the surface.
Good point. Yeah. Thank you.
He
Yes.
really thinks Emma's in love with Frank. Sorry, he really thinks Emma is in love with Frank because, when it turns out Frank's engaged, he's like, oh, I feel so bad for you and all this. And she's like, no, I'm fine. but he thinks that she's in love. So he must think that there's a possibility at least she's going to marry him till it all comes
Yeah,
out.
I mean, he says that, part of the part of his concern with her and Frank is he thinks that her bad behavior is a reflection of, Frank Churchill, because he has such a low opinion of Frank Churchill, going off to get his hair cut for no reason, Frank Churchill is sort of like the modern day Kardashian. It just seems to put that into, to put that in some sort of kind of modern context, going off to get your hair cut. But it just seems like that is, part of his issue is he sees Frank's influence over Emma in those kind of comments.
And Frank does have a bad influence over Emma. It seems like he just eggs her on to whatever she tends to do.
Yeah, the whole exchange with the word game and the teasing of Jane Fairfax, and then Frank's making little comments regarding how Jane looks. I think those are examples of him using a bad behavioral influence over Emma. She probably would not have been as cavalier in saying that at Box Hill to Miss Bates had it not been for Frank's approach and attitude towards people. So I think she was negatively influenced.
So here's a question. Do people think that Frank Churchill changes at all?
I
No.
don't.
No, not
I don't think
really.
So,
Not really.
He's
In fact, I
very
think that's
selfish. He
something about
used Emma to deflect attention away from Jane Fairfax. He courted Emma and groomed her and all that, without any concern for her feelings, because I think he knew that they were hoping something would happen, and it just deflected any attention away from any feeling that there might be something between him and Jane. So he basically just used Emma.
I
Would you-
agree.
Would you say Frank Churchill's a bit narcissistic?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
You wonder about his character because he's raised by this rich couple, and he's kind of indulged, I think, and doesn't seem to really take much responsibility for his wealth. Not only that, but Knightley says, he's got everything. He's got the woman he loves. He's got the good opinion of this village. He's got it all. And he said he envied him in some respects.
And at the end, I think he apologizes to Jane and gets forgiven. So maybe he did repent from some of the things he did. I don't know.
I think
Emma-
that's a really good question that Frances brings up, because I think that the idea that there's hope for Frank Churchill, because his, hopefully in terms of where that hope comes from, is that we hope that Jane Fairfax has a good influence on him, and that he takes to heart some of what his father has told him, and what his mother-in-law or his new mother-in-law has told him, those examples. So I think that it's an interesting question. I don't think we see enough of Frank Churchill to have a lot of hope, just based on what his actions, but we can only have hope with Frank Churchill.
I was going to say that we're just hoping Jane Fairfax is as wonderful an influence as she seems through the novel. Maybe she can do something with him.
I'm wondering, do you think that Emma ever actually was in love or thought she might be in love with Frank Churchill? And because at the beginning, she's very excited to meet him, and there's a lot of expectations around that. And if so, at what point did she perhaps realize early on that he wasn't, let's say, as honorable of a person as she had thought he might be, even before others around her realized that? She didn't know what it was, but she knew there was something about him. Like, what kept her from falling in love with Frank Churchill? Because he was leading her on.
I think she didn't think about falling in love because she didn't need to. She has a home. She has wealth. She said, I don't need to get married. It's I'm fine the way I am. So she was looking at it, I think, more from an arm's length standpoint. Oh, here's somebody new in the village. This will be fun. And then when he goes off to London to get his hair cut, she's like, okay, what's going on with this guy?
I wonder if, like, at some level she was comparing him to Mr. Knightley, who maybe she was already in love with but didn't realize, or at least she's comparing him and going, this guy is not my hero. So
I think that's very possible. But I also think someone just said that, he's the new guy in the village. I think Jane Austen really gives us a little picture of what it must have been like, even for someone like Emma who has money. It must have been extremely dull to live in this little village. Her evenings are spent sitting across from her father, playing backgammon, I think, or, sometimes reading a book. It must have been very dull. And having Frank Churchill come in, how exciting. And he's been so built up by the Westons, because there are so many times where he has disappointed them. So the anticipation of meeting him, I think, was part of what led Emma to think, I can talk myself into falling in love with him. But we see how absurd that is. She can't really talk herself into it.
I think she has this idea of him because of her relationship with the Westons, right? But then also because he's got that money, he's now more on her level. So she kind of thinks like he belongs to her. But also, yeah, there are no new young hot guys around. And he's exciting and worldly, and it's amazing. And it's just like when you're a teenager. True, she is 20. And there's a boy, and it's all exciting, and you think that that's love. And you don't realize that real love is the comfortable, kind of boring bits where you're like, I'm happy to just hang out with you and not talk at all. And so she might have thought that she was in love with him at some point, but it didn't seem to last terribly long because of that excitement, because she thought that that's what you needed, I think, to have love. And that's part of the reason it took so long to realize about her feelings for Mr. Knightley, because they were just so comfortable with each other. And it wasn't until that was threatened for both of them that they realized their feelings.
I can be totally if someone could convince me that I'm giving Emma more credit than she deserves. But if we think about like everything that everyone's just said, so Frank Churchill comes in and she's intrigued by him. And like we said, she's heard his name for years and years and years and years and years. And here he finally is. But if we think about what were their exchanges, their exchanges were, fun. But they also involved a lot of gossip, right? About other people and, oh, who sent this pianoforte and, blah, 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 blah. And it certainly seemed at the time when you're reading these passages, it seems like, oh, Emma's having fun with the gossip. But maybe, like people have said, that seemed empty and hollow to her at the end of the day. And so when he would go away to do whatever he would do, she wouldn't miss him. She wouldn't necessarily miss him.
I also think that being that she's in such a tiny little village, Frank was the first person probably that came remotely close to flirting with her. And that's, it's an experience that as a young woman, she may not have had yet. And maybe hadn't been able to have experience with and be able to weigh, whether the gossip and all that was something he was doing to provide amusement for her, or whether that was really more a reflection on his own character.
Have you heard the saying, if you refuse to engage in a battle of wits with an unarmed person? She finally had a foil, someone that she could spar with about a third party, and nobody's feelings are hurt. And so it's just a lot of fun. I agree with Cindy about that.
I'm wondering if we could switch to a different hero. If we could start talking about Captain Wentworth. I'm just curious what you guys think about how much he changed it. I thought of him when I think Mary was talking about Edmund Bertram quite a while back, that Edmund really changed his attitude and learned to appreciate Fanny. And you see the same kind of thing with Captain Wentworth, that he's, first of all, he wants nothing to do with Anne, and then he starts to appreciate who she really is. Do you guys think that he changed in his character or just in his view of her? What do y'all think?
Can I bring up one thing? I don't mean to interrupt, but there was one question I had about Mr. Knightley.
Okay, back to Mr. Knightley.
And then I just want to throw this out. Do you think that Mr. Knightley was in love with Emma all along and he was just waiting for her to grow up so that they could be together? Because I think he realized when she was very young that she was extraordinary and that she had a lot of potential. And he was like, oh, this is somebody I could be with. And he was just kind of biding his time. Do you think that, what do you guys think?
No.
No.
Not till Frank Churchill came did he, he may have loved her in a way, but wasn't like aware of it as love. I think until Frank Churchill came.
Okay.
It wasn't until jealousy struck.
Kind of like with Emma, didn't realize that she loved him until she thought he might be in love with Harriet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, they
true.
both had were stricken with jealousy, and that brought reality into focus.
Okay. All right. Now back to Captain Wentworth.
Back to Wentworth.
Okay. Did Mr. Knightley say something to that effect, that he's watched her grown up? And, I got the impression he had an earlier affection for her, maybe as a child. I don't.
Yes, but I feel like we don't want it to be true because it's creepy.
Yeah, he stays single all that time. He's like 37 and he's never married. And
But he specifically says to Emma, "Can you actually love me?" So he didn't assume, he didn't groom, he didn't go that far.
Okay.
Still creepy.
It's creepy.
Not creepy.
It's just in today's context, when
We
you
do
think
not
about
want our
it,
Mr. Knightley to be
it
creepy.
just, no, we don't want him, we don't want
No.
Mr. Knightley, we love Mr. Knightley.
Okay, Wentworth.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you all.
Wentworth.
And we
I-
love Captain Wentworth too. We don't want him to have any flaws.
See, I think there's two ways that you could potentially interpret Captain Wentworth, that he does go through a change or he just gets over being hurt. Because a lot of his actions are fueled by the fact that he's still hurt by what happened with Anne. And you could argue that he doesn't actually change, he just gets over being hurt. And because of that, he stops acting the way that he was, because his actions were previously fueled by, oh, I'm going to flirt with this girl in front of Anne because I don't care about her. Thoughts?
I think that I don't think he really understood how wonderful Anne was when they first got engaged, and that it's actually good for Anne that they didn't get married at that point, because he didn't understand how wonderful she was. He didn't understand why she said no. You know, he thought she was weak, and she did it because she felt a sense of duty to her family and because she thought it was for his own good. So I feel like he had to change a lot in order to be good enough for Anne.
But did he have to change his character or just change his mind, his attitudes? That's what I'm.
He had to get over his resentment. I mean, he resented what she
Oh, yeah.
did.
He was
Big time.
angry.
He had
And
to
that-
let go.
He had to
Yeah.
forget.
And
So
remind
that-
me what the lady,
Lady Russell.
Lady Russell. So thank you. Would you say that Captain Wentworth realized so he didn't resent Anne, or maybe at the end he was able to direct all of his resentment on Lady Russell, and that cleared up whatever he felt on that in that regard. He blamed it all on Lady Russell, and then that exonerated Anne. And
No, I think he
Remember,
was
what
better
was the
than that.
line?
Yeah,
I'm trying to
I
remember.
think,
say
He was
that
working on
again.
forgiving her.
I think he was better than that. I think he forgave Lady Russell too.
Well, I think at the end he says, I'm not there yet. I will
Yes.
forgive her at some point, but I'm just not there yet, which I
Yeah.
think is very human.
It is. It is.
Well, it seems that whenever he learned that Anne had turned down the marriage proposal from Charles Musgrove, and that Lady Russell was involved in that helped him to feel like, oh, well, it wasn't just me.
Yeah.
Well, it also showed him that Anne still cared about him when he found out that she turned down Charles. I feel like Anne and Captain Wentworth had a lot in common in that they both had this strong sense of duty. She had a strong sense of duty to her family, but he's in the Navy. He had a strong sense of duty to the Navy. And then he's like, okay, I'm going to have to marry Louisa because I've raised these expectations, right? He was an honorable person already.
Mm-hmm. But I think Louisa really opens his eyes also because, he keeps talking about how he wants someone who is, has conviction about her ideas and her, goals. And he doesn't want someone who can be persuaded, in air quotes. And then when he sees how very stubborn Louisa is, so stubborn that she insists upon jumping off of the wall, he realizes conviction is good, but too much is not so great. And I think that's when he begins to realize things are not black and white, and I have to really sit down and reassess and, look at Anne with the new understanding.
Yeah, he has an epiphany there, doesn't he? He realized that he's been mistaken. Like he was looking just for somebody with strong will, and that's not really what he wanted or what's good even.
I kind of feel like their early relationship was based on kind of passionate love. And, Austen really isn't for passionate love. She's for passionate love and like kind of companionate and kind of responsible, equal worth love. You can have both, but you can't just have passion. And I felt like he especially, I don't think knew her really. And they kind of had to go through many trials once they got back together for him to really see all of her good qualities.
I had a different impression. I had the impression, especially when Anne started tending to Louisa after she fell, that seeing Anne, rush to pitch in and help and straighten, take a real practical approach to fixing the situation, that it reminded him of all the good qualities that he used to know in her. I think I had the sense that he really did get to know her some over the summer that they were in Lust, let's call it. But that when she turned him down, he pushed a lot of those good qualities kind of into a corner to kind of justify his ego, or assuage his ego, maybe is a better word.
I think it also pointed out to him the maturity differences between Louisa and Anne, not only at that point in the novel when they're about 10 years difference, but that Anne at that age would not have behaved the way that Louisa did. She was not reckless. And I mean, you got to think he needs to be practical. He's a ship's captain. He has lots of people relying on him, and he needs someone that he can rely on. And Louisa is not that person. And he didn't realize that. And he didn't realize that Anne, although yes, she may have made a decision he did not agree with, but she is a reliable person. And she had that maturity even at 19 that Louisa unfortunately lacked.
Agreed.
Yeah. I've always been confused about why Captain Wentworth didn't understand until later. Oh gosh, I've been paying all this attention to Louisa. Do you think I've raised her expectations? Somebody would have known that all along. And why is it coming as a surprise later? Like, oh gosh, am I on the hook now for this girl I don't want because I've been talking to her a lot? That didn't make sense to me.
The only explanation that pops to mind is that he had been at sea with too many other men for too long and was rusty at his dating skills.
I agree with that.
I think it highlights he was being thoughtless. He wasn't thinking about what he was doing because he was hurt and he was trying to hurt Anne, and he was not thinking about the consequences of his actions, which then led Louisa to not think about the consequences of her actions. Had he actually been thinking about it, because even his sister and his brother-in-law were asking which of the girls he was going to marry very early on.
So I want to push back a little bit. I agree for the most part with what you just said, but I think you ended by saying that his sister and brother-in-law have expectations that now that he's on land, there's no war, he's made money, he's going to get married. So I think agreed completely that he was thoughtless, but I think he is also looking for a wife. And I think, he doesn't quite know, I guess, how to play the marriage game. As someone said, he'd been on a ship for all this time. So I don't think it was only that he was being thoughtless. I think he really was considering Louisa as a potential, partner until he realized this is not the right person for me. And and then once other people say, well, she's expecting you to marry her, or however they alert him to it, he recognizes that he overplayed his hand.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mary, because he says at one point, like, anybody between this age and that age can have me. Like, he was looking for a wife, and he was probably thinking Louisa might be a good choice. And then when he realized she wasn't, he had raised those expectations. So then he had to deal with that.
And I think we actually also have to sort of contrast him with Frank Churchill, because somebody said earlier when we were talking about Frank Churchill, how he flirted with Emma, and not even caring about whether he was leading her on. I think we see, when Wentworth realizes that he may have been doing the same thing to Louisa Musgrove, he's going to take the honorable route. and he'll marry her if he has to.
I felt like Austen had to kind of really walk a tightrope with Wentworth of like how to make it believable that he is interested in Louisa, but also like how not to totally make him come off looking like he's a bad person by hurting Anne. And so I think it has to be like he was kind of oblivious to how much what he did hurt Anne, and how much he was kind of getting himself into a corner in terms of how he had been treating Louisa. And
I almost feel like she wrote herself into a corner there, and she had to do something to get him out of it. So she was like, okay, let's marry Captain Benwick, because that's seems really unlikely,
One of the things I noticed is that some of the most hurtful comments that Anne hears reportedly, out of the mouth of Captain Wentworth come through her sister Mary. When she stays home for dinner, taking care of the injured child, and Mary reports that Wentworth said he barely would have recognized Anne at this point. She looked so much altered. I mean, Mary's the one who plants a lot of little poison darts, and we really don't know exactly that Wentworth worded them quite as strongly as Mary did.
Good point.
Poor Captain Wentworth.
Mary kind of had a chip on her shoulder, and she was always trying to make things look better for her and less good for others, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
But then again, you had the little being stricken with jealousy when they were in Bath, and Mr. Elliot is in the picture, and he starts to hear the possibility that Mr. Elliot and Anne are to be engaged, and so when he left the music program early, he was realizing that he had competition.
He really gives up too easily.
Mm-hmm.
You see that all through the book. It's almost like he's not following Admiral Nelson's "you just head straight at him and go" mentality at all. He's doing evasive action and taking the wrong signals, and it's kind of surprising, really.
Yeah, they say in the end, after a couple of years, he could have contacted Anne and they could have, gotten re-engaged then, but he was too bitter, it seems like.
Well, maybe he had some deep insecurities, and those insecurities were what fueled his to give up too soon. And particularly when you think about it, he didn't have enough money to be thought of as a good prospect, and that in itself would probably cause the insecurities to loom large. But then after you change that status, it doesn't necessarily solve all the insecurities that are there already. And so that would be my guess in that respect. And of course, Mr. Elliot didn't have that issue, and he could be well represented, all along, at least from Wentworth's perspective. And so he just felt like he wasn't up at the same level to be able to compete well enough.
I agree with you. Plus, I think there's another element in addition to the money. I think Austen, throughout that book, really makes it so clear that in a society where you're starting to see some social upward mobility, there are people who adhere to the old class system without, with blinders on. Like, what is Anne's father? Baronet. The way he, his favorite book is the book of whatever the book is. But Austen talks a lot in that book about the Navy being one path to elevate people who are deserving. The country's beginning to be a little bit of a meritocracy for some people. And I think, it's not only the money, it's the fact that Anne comes from a little bit of a different, sphere or class.
I had a question about jealousy. Betty brought up that it was Wentworth's jealousy that partly made him realise his feelings for Anne and change his behaviour. Do we think that jealousy, in addition to making the men realise they're in love, because we saw the same thing with Mr. Knightley, is it also a way for them to change, to then become the men that their women deserve?
Ask it your question again.
So jealousy is makes the men realize that they're in love with the woman, but is it the jealousy that makes them change to become more deserving of these women?
Frances, are you thinking of a specific example, or?
Well, you could say Captain Wentworth, for example, because it's not till he says, I saw Mr. Elliot look at you and it made me start to look at you and start to appreciate you more.
I got you.
You know what they say, sunshine is a great disinfectant. It's sort of like that shining a light on that, in that realization almost acts like a disinfectant to what we're talking about.
Especially with somebody like Anne, who's so quiet and so easily overlooked and treated like dirt by her family. She's easy not to see. I see what Frances is getting at.
Yeah, sorry, it was when Wentworth first saw Mr. Elliot admiring Anne, that he was like, oh yeah, she is still a beautiful woman, right? So I guess that helped to wake him up, didn't it? Good point. Sorry, somebody else was talking. Apology.
Not at all. I was just wondering about the difference between apologies and change. We've talked a lot about different people who said they were sorry about something that they've done, but is that any proof that they'll change, or is that their besetting sin or blind spot or whatever it is that they're going to have the rest of their lives? And maybe should the females in these stories take that as a warning rather than as a proof of change?
I think it's at least the first step to recognize your failures and be able to apologize for them is a first step. Because a lot of these heroes need to learn humility, right? So being able to apologize is a first step there, but it doesn't mean that they've necessarily changed, obviously.
I think Frank Churchill, not a hero necessarily, but he is still a red flag. He apologizes, but it's not clear that he will ever change.
Yeah, we don't get to see.
Throw Darcy back. Throw Darcy back in. He doesn't have to act like Wickham, but with a little more social gloss, just a little bit on his part, he will be more lovable and more approachable, and life will actually be better for him. He won't be walking around not talking to anybody.
I think Darcy has to change deeper than that. I think he has to change so that he is more aware of other people's feelings. He's aware of his very small circle of, Bingley and his sister. He's aware of their feelings, but he's not really aware of other people's feelings and in the beginning. And I think that he really does make a profound change in order to be worthy of Elizabeth, of hey, other people have feelings. I shouldn't hurt them.
And it's interesting because I totally agree with that point. But then as you were talking about that, I thought about Elizabeth's trip, unexpected trip to the Peak District, and all the fabulous things that I'll just call her Mrs. Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds said about Mr. Darcy. So it's kind of one of these things where it seems like and again, it goes back to his, he's not good around people, like initially at least. So it seems as though, he gets there, but he gets there after it takes him a while to get there. And I keep going back to the Elizabeth's exchange with Mr. Wickham, where she says in Essentials that he was always as he's ever been, or I know I've got that line wrong, but she specifically mentions his essentials. And so it's not that, he's this horrible person, which we know he's not, but it's how he applies, the values that he's been given by his parents.
I agree. I agree with you. Plus, we love Elizabeth, but if you look at the way she behaves early on in the book, she engages in gossip with Mr. Wickham on the day that they first meet. She knows nothing about him, and yet she sits there and listens to him tell a story that really is so inappropriate for someone to share with someone they've only just met, especially, then. I think it would be inappropriate today, but certainly back in, the Regency era, when he tells her about the horrible story of how Darcy has treated him, and she just buys it hook, line, and sinker, sort of the way Emma does when Frank Churchill says horrible things about Jane Fairfax. I think that they both undergo a significant change in Pride and Prejudice. Well, Elizabeth realizes that she shouldn't have just, fallen in with what Wickham told her.
I'm thinking about Darcy. It seems like he's the character in all of the books that we most get to see how much he changes, right? So he doesn't just say he changes. He is friendly to the gardeners. He goes and rescues Lydia. He convinces Bingley to go back to Jane. I mean, you can just see this 180-degree change in his life. It's pretty amazing. For most of the others, it's just kind of hinted at the end.
I think we see a little bit of that with Knightley, and that's why the book continues, they come to their agreement in chapter 13, and there's 50 more pages of the book, and it's we have to see that Mr. Knightley starts treating Emma much more kindly, and is very, that they're more playful with each other. So it's you have to see that he's changed also.
Good point.
Plus, he has the willingness to move into Hartford. The name of their estate is Hartfield. He's willing to leave his place,
Donwell Abbey. Donwell Abbey.
Donwell Abbey. Okay, thank you. I don't know why my mind's gone blank. I'm supposed to know all this stuff. But the fact that that's a big change to even though he's used to walking back and forth every day, but to actually move in and to leave Donwell Abbey, let Donwell Abbey be the destination for his daily walks. So he just sort of reversing his schedule in that sense. So he's willing to change his routine.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
Takes a big sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And basically has to submit to Mr. Woodhouse's life. Mr. Woodhouse is still the titular head of the household in Hartfield.
So I think that's a strong example of his love for Emma, that he's willing to submit to that circumstance. Of course, he has, I would say, a lot of respect for him, but at least in the other, in the pre-marriage mode, he at least could escape that. He was just subjected to it while he was present.
But he was always very patient, like Emma.
Yes.
It's amazing how patient they are with Mr. Woodhouse.
Yeah, and how they kind of tag team with each other to manage him.
And I especially loved the scene where they were doing with the strawberry picking, that Mr. Knightley had all of the little things for him to be entertained by the fire.
Yep.
All his favorite things
All taken care of. Yep.
Like you would plan for a child.
Mhm.
Anybody want to talk about like Edmund Bertram or Edward Ferrars? How they might change?
Well,
How about Colonel Brandon?
I like Colonel Brandon. I think he's a great character.
I do as well. And I was reflecting, I don't know that I saw any evidence of change in his personality during the story. I just thought he showed a great deal of mature patience.
Yeah, and I think like from the beginning, he clearly like wanted what was best for Marianne, even if that wasn't him. And so I feel like he didn't really maybe have to change because he was already like this very mature, thoughtful person.
He didn't have a flaw.
That's not that we wouldn't like a character who was completely flawless. I think that's my opinion. So I mean, if you want to like think hard about identifying some change, perhaps that he made, I would say he came out of the shadows a little bit. He was willing to let, as you said, he wanted what was best for Marianne, and he stepped back. He took a back seat, but then towards the end, he really came forward and made his interest known. He became more outspoken about the fact that he wanted a future with Marianne, and I think that was a positive change.
I thought
I think
he was
another positive change with him too is just him opening up. I mean, it sounded as though, and again, we don't, know all this, but it sounded as though, with his history, it had been several years since he'd, really been in any sort of relationship, and he'd spent all of his time trying to find his ward. And so he's allowing himself to be happy. He's opening himself up and allowing himself to be happy, whether or not that's with Marianne or whoever that might be with. So that's a positive change.
I think he also had to suffer through many long dinners with the couple that was the center of gossip in the neighborhood. And if that can drive a person to be a little bit more closed in their personal matters.
I think that's the change that he had. To me, he seemed hopeless. He had given up on having a wife for himself. He worried about his ward. Then all of a sudden, the Dashwoods come into the neighborhood, and he's enamored with Marianne. And he almost seems depressed, you know what I mean? And then over the course of the book, he seems to think that, well, maybe I can have a wife, maybe I can have a relationship, maybe there's a chance for me with Marianne. And he kind of comes around that way, and then is very proactive as far as when she's sick, going to get her mother and all that, and trying to be useful.
I think he had a sense of what was in his power to do and what wasn't in his power to do. And I think he was very respectful when he saw he didn't have the power to affect a change or to make something happen. But we should give him this. He exercised what I like to call pleasant persistence. he stuck with it, and he kept showing up ever so quietly, but he kept following up in a very measured way. And he would stay in touch. And then when he realized he had something he could contribute, and that was the living to Edward, he could offer that. He knew he couldn't go directly to Edward, but that allowed him to go to Eleanor. And it's not that he was using that to be able to get in, but it was just that he knew the proper channels that would allow that offer to be made in a more, in a way that would be more appropriate for the situation and the manners.
Are we going to talk about Robert Ferrars?
Oh my.
I don't think it changes. Seems to stay the same.
He's up there with Wickham.
He accepted this young woman who had no prospects. So that was a
Well, he was rich then. His mom had given him everything he wanted. So
Plus,
I
he's
love
so
how
lucky.
he's treated in that story. Every time he shows up, it just makes me laugh. It's so funny.
it's funny.
The
How
whole
much
thing-
Eleanor hates him is hilarious. We always think Eleanor is so wonderful, but she really hates Robert. And I just love that she hates him.
He didn't deserve rational opposition.
Does she hate him or she just despises, looks down on him and thinks he's nothing?
Well,
What do you
there's one thing where she gives him a look of contempt and he totally, it goes over his head.
Yeah,
And
there we go.
so I guess that look of contempt made me think.
She thinks
hates
he's not worthwhile.
But
Well,
Sees him for what he is, which is not a good person.
I love how Jane uses the whole scene with him wanting that toothpick box.
Yeah.
And that she used that to just paint the picture of who he was.
Triviality, right?
I'll have to go back and reread that. I don't remember that. But I mean, I think he doesn't outright steal his brother's fortune and girl, but he does, essentially. I mean, that's virtually what he ends up doing is he steals his brother's fortune. He steals the girl because the girl, Lucy Steele. Oh, that's so interesting. Her name is Steele. Lucy Steele is conniving, I think, and she's much more suited to Robert than to Edward. But I mean, Robert doesn't seem to think twice about how this whole change of dynamics has impacted his brother's life and really, robbed him of a more comfortable life. So there's a sort of closing the loop in that story. The beginning is where, what's his name? John Dashwood. His father implores him to please take care of his stepmother and his two half sisters. And he doesn't. He's easily talked out of it by his wife. And then at the end, Robert Ferrars really, could have extended some, not branch, but tried to make his brother's life more comfortable financially, but he doesn't do anything to help his brother.
Well, he'd been grooming his mother all along as the younger son. He had to be really nice to the mom because she held the purse strings and she used her money to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm.
So he was always fawning all over his mother because he needed her. And then he was in the perfect position when she got mad at Edward.
Mm.
I don't know if he was even fawning over. He just was the kind of person that his mother wanted her sons to be, right? Leader in society or whatever, concerned about all these social things that she was concerned about and not concerned about more serious things like Edward was. He just was the son that she wanted.
That's true. But the reason she disinherits Edward is because he marries a penniless, or he's
I know.
the penniless girl, Lucy Steele, who has no status and no money. And yet Robert does the same thing. So once he's secure with the money, he basically flings it in his mother's face, I think.
He does, exactly.
He always struck me as a bit of a party boy. I remember particularly the scene where Marianne is freaking out having seen Willoughby at the dance and needs to go home early. And Robert's right there saying, "Oh, I can take Lucy home later. We'll stay here and dance together." No, he's trying to be gallant, but it's really all for him. He just wants to have a pretty girl on his arm to party with.
I think that was just in the movie, not in the book.
Oh, sorry, I made me crossing those wires.
I mean, what we're saying is just the way that Austen ends the book. What Edward had done to forfeit the right of the eldest son might have puzzled many people to find out, and what Robert had done to succeed to it might have puzzled them still more. It was an arrangement, however, justified in its effects, if not in its cause, for nothing ever appeared in Robert's style of living or of talking to give a suspicion of his regretting the extent of his income as either leaving his brother too little or bringing himself too much. It's just like Austen just points all this stuff out to us, and it's hilarious.
I want to say that I really like Edward, probably better than a lot of people do. I like him. I think he was, you think of a 19-year-old boy getting, being around a pretty girl and thinking he's in love, and I forgive him a lot, and I just like him. So.
Well, he was honorable. He was going to go ahead and marry her, even though he didn't love her. He felt honor bound.
Right, like Captain Wentworth. I agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although he's not my favorite character, Edward.
What I like is how at the end, Edward and Eleanor end up with close to $1,000 and total independence from his mother. And Robert and Lucy have about $1,000, but they have to like be always, jumbled up with John and Fanny Dashwood and Mrs. Ferrars. So like, I think Eleanor and Edward just, they end up kind of being free.
They get what they deserve.
They kind of get their poetic justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he got the living that he wanted. He wanted to be a clergy.
Yes.
A country in the country.
Yeah.
Yeah, the next part of that quote is, and if Edward might be judged from the ready discharge of his duties in every particular, in other words, his duties as a clergyman, from an increasing attachment to his wife and his home, and from the regular cheerfulness of his spirits, that's, I think, the main way he changes. He was not cheerful at the beginning. He might be supposed no less content with his lot. So, yeah, they each got what they wanted.
Yeah, they were really prisoners by the order of their birth. Because had they been switched, Edward could have always been a clergyman because it was common for the second son to go into their clergy, wasn't it? And for the first son to inherit and run the estate and keep the family name. So both of them were struggling against circumstances that they had no control over.
Well, and a mother who was totally unreasonable too.
Yeah, it seemed like Edward never was a first son in because she controlled whether he actually had the estate or not. So like he was always in a dependent situation, whereas like Darcy and Knightley were both first sons and like knew that they had power. Edward had no power. It was all in his mother's hands. Well, he had the power of 2,000 pounds of his own money.
Just because his parents were still alive, as opposed to Darcy and Knightley's parents having already passed on.
Yeah.
But I think also the way that the
will
was set up, the mother controlled the money. So
yes,
I think Knightley and Darcy, even when they were alive, when their parents were alive, it was clear that their will was set up clearly.
Yeah, I mean, normally when his father died, he would have inherited whatever he was going to inherit, right? And his mother would be like the dowager or whatever, but apparently it wasn't set up that way in their family.
Right. That's a good point.
And I can't, for some reason, the name's escaping me, but the Eleanor and Marianne's brother, his wife,
Fanny,
controlling the money all behind the scenes. She was controlling him and how he doled out the money to his sisters and his mother. So
Yeah.
even though the women did not technically have power, they were exuding power. They were controlling things behind the scene in terms of finances, family finances.
She's just very tricky. Like she can convince him to whatever she wants, right? Fanny and John, their conversations.
Fanny and John,
Yeah.
yeah.
She's convincing him that he's doing what's right, even though he knows it isn't.
But he wants to be persuaded. He doesn't want to let go of that money.
Oh, that's true.
Well, and
Much-
especially using his son against the argument, you know, like this is your blood. They are not your blood.
We're going to deprive little Harry.
Yeah. Anyone that we missed that people want to talk, you know, we've got just a few minutes left. Anyone else have anything that they didn't get a chance to say that they want to have a chance to talk about?
Well, what about that fellow in Northanger Abbey who is after Catherine? I can't think of his name now.
John Thorpe.
Oh, right. John. His name is John something.
John Thorpe.
John Thorpe.
John Thorpe.
He's a terrible person.
Definitely not a hero.
He's kind of like Robert Ferrars, like just interested
Yeah.
in Bill.
The cad.
But he gossips a lot more about other people's affairs that he doesn't even know. You know, he got Catherine in so much trouble because he assumed that she would inherit, and he told Tilney, General Tilney, all this stuff.
You know, gossip really is a big part of all of these novels when you think about it. It really makes the plot twist and turn and affects people's lives. You know, that would be a definite theme on to talk about it, like in an AGM. You could just talk about all the gossip and all the damage that it does. It
And how
really
did
does
John
anything good.
Thorpe? How did John Thorpe get together with James, Catherine's brother? James seems like a nice enough young
They met
man.
at Oxford,
They were
right?
at school together.
Yeah, but they weren't very well suited to be friends, and he was dangerous to introduce to James's family.
I think John Thorpe's quote unquote superpower, if you will, is that he can manipulate people, and he kind of what's the word I want to use?
Insinuates.
Well, he can he can just you can feel like you've been taken over by him, and that he can overpower you where you can't say no, and he just thinks fast, talks fast, and lies, and doesn't
Certainly
care.
did that to Catherine, like with the carriage ride and all that. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
You know, like
And
he just,
Catherine's brother might have been just as naive as she was and gullible, right? To not recognize his lies.
Yeah, I think that was implied.
Yeah, they were just nice. They were just a nice family, and they'd never had any experience with anybody like that. I mean, Isabella did the same thing. So they just didn't know how to deal with it because they'd never had that deceitful experience before, you know, people manipulating them and lying to them and, you know, two-faced and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. If you've never run into that type of character before, it sort of fits a category I have in life. It's things I didn't know I had to worry about. So the John Thorpe character, he had no idea he had to worry about running into someone like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, that sort of the education, the theme of like, yeah, how do you learn to navigate the social world was really, you know, what Catherine had to learn in Northanger Abbey. One of the things she had to learn.
I was thinking that there's guys like John Thorpe living today. They're not proud of their carriage, but they've got some fancy car they want to show off to some girl and act about the same way.
Exactly.
But we can't lose sight of the fact that he was also a fortune hunter. He believed that she was going to inherit her wealthy neighbor's estate. So he was a fortune hunter, just as his sister was.
Then why did he tell General Tilney about all this? Is a question. I don't. I'm not.
Boasting.
Yeah,
boasting.
Boasting.
bragging.
I'm going to marry this girl and she's really rich.
I
Right?
agree.
I will say, I've always been amazed that General Tilney believed John Thorpe.
Yeah.
To the level that he would have invited Catherine, that they would have left Bath and he would have invited Catherine. I mean, he went to a lot of trouble based on what he heard from someone like John Thorpe. That's always been a bit baffling to me.
Maybe it was, again, that was what he wanted to hear. Just like
too.
John Dashwood, that's what he wanted to hear, that he didn't have to do anything.
Maybe
So,
maybe the Northanger Abbey needed a lot of repairs, and he needed Tilney to marry a rich wife.
He gambled too. Gambling.
And what was it he was growing in that greenhouse? Was it pineapples?
Yeah.
Pineapples, yeah.
He had a
Very
pinery.
expensive pineapples.
Very expensive, yeah.
All right. Well, I think it's about time to wrap up. Thanks everyone for coming. So this, I'll put the recording on our website, and then I'll send the link out when we do that, if anyone wants to watch it again. But I'm really glad we had such a dynamic discussion today, and so many people speaking up and talking. So hopefully it seemed like it was a good topic for people. I think sometimes having something instead of just the book discussion is interesting. So I'm going to stop the